Alicia Weintraub, and I just wanted to welcome everybody to the first ever Mayor's Youth Council Young Voter Night. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Just wanted to thank everybody who's a part of the Mayor's Youth Council. We have the chair here, Adam Jason, so thank you for everything that you're doing, and thank you to Katie Poole for putting everything together and all the work that you've done on this topic. Joined here tonight in the audience is Councilmember David Shapiro, whose idea was the Mayor's Youth Council, and Mayor Pro Tem James Bozajian, and Councilmember Fred Gaines, who you will hear more from. But just wanted to welcome everybody here tonight, and I will turn this over to Katie.
Thank you. So tonight we are really fortunate to have Calabasas Mayor Pro Tem James Bozajian and Councilmember Fred Gaines as our speakers. And together they have co-hosted a post-election show on CTV for the past 15 years and have spent many years of their lives dedicated to serving our community. So now I would like to introduce the Calabasas City Clerk, Marie Hernandez, to explain our PSA that we'll be showing tonight.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Bozajian and Councilmember Gaines, for participating in this great event. So the County of Los Angeles has changed the way we vote. It's called the system, or the new program is called Voting Solutions for All People. What I'm going to do is play a short video, or a short PSA, so you guys can view it, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. And again, thank you all for being here tonight.
It is 2020, and that means it's an election year. We'll go to the polls March 3rd. Now, March 3rd, you probably know, is a presidential primary, but in the city of Calabasas, we get a twofer, because in the city, it is also a special election for one particular initiative, and that is Measure N. It asks Calabasas voters to decide on a plan for low-income units and a planned expansion of the Avalon apartment complex. Regardless of what's on the ballot, the way we vote has changed dramatically. Yes, you can still vote by mail, but gone are the neighborhood polling places. Instead, LA County will have fully accessible vote centers, hundreds of them. The difference? Size. A vote center will be larger and accommodate more people. Also, vote centers will be open to vote for up to 11 days before Election Day, not just one day to vote. And you can vote at any vote center in the entire county. You don't need to use the one closest to your home address. In Calabasas, we will have 5 vote centers. One of them will be right here at the Agoura Hills Calabasas Community Center. This vote center will be open the longest, the full 11 days. The way we vote will also be a little different. No hole punching, it is now electronic. Touchscreen, tactile keypad, headphones for an audio ballot, and a dual switch for compatible assisted technologies. Select your language. The touchscreen allows you to mark and review your selections and make any changes. Remember, the More button will show you the remaining choices. Once you're satisfied with your selections, cast your paper ballot directly into the secure ballot box. You can also use an interactive sample ballot online. Mark your selections and generate a poll pass that you can either print or save on your mobile device. Bring your poll pass to the vote center. Scan it on the ballot device to transfer your selections. Review your selections, make any changes, and then cast your ballot. Remember, there will be staff at all vote centers who can help you. And of course, you can still vote by mail. For more information, go to cityofcalabasas.com.
Well, Fred, it's a pleasure to be back up here with you, as we have been doing this thing for, about 15 years now, as misstated, probably almost as long as most of you have been around. We're going to go through the ballot from top to bottom, and we're going to discuss everything measure by measure and candidate by, or election race by election race. And afterwards, if you have questions, you can certainly ask them of us, and we'll leave time for questions. So I'm going to start out with the race for state senate. We are located in the 27th state senate district. The state senate's the upper house of our state legislature. There are 40 state senators serving California, which means that there's one state senator for about 1 million people, which is a very small legislature for the size of the state. have to remember the numbers were made long, long ago when the state was very sparsely populated. State Senate terms last for 4 years. They are, there's term limits. They're limited to 3 terms, which would be 12 years. And the way it works is all of the candidates appear, regardless of party, together, and the top 2 vote getters proceed to the general election, regardless of what the percentages of the votes are. So you can't win just in the primary for the state Senate race. In our state assembly races, most of Calabasas is located in the 45th Assembly District. A part of Calabasas, due to a little error that was made by the Redistricting Commission, a small part. Is anyone from Mont Calabasas here? Okay, Mont Calabasas is located in the 50th Assembly District. So almost all of the cities in the 45th District. There are 80 state assembly members, meaning each one of them represent about 500,000 people. State assembly members have 2-year terms, which means they're up for election every 2 years, and they're going to be on every even-yeared election ballot. They are limited to 4 terms or 8 years in office. And again, the top 2 vote getters, regardless of party and regardless of what percentage of the vote they get, the top 2 proceed to the general election. On your ballot this year in the 45th Assembly District, there is only 1 candidate on your ballot. However, there is a qualified write-in candidate. There might be 2. As long as one of those write-in candidates gets 1 vote out of the entire district, they will be eligible to proceed to the general election. So write-ins, you can't just write in any candidate's name. They have to be a certified, qualified write-in candidate. And if you have questions about that, you can always go to the polling place or go online, and they have a list of qualified write-ins. Finally, in this segment, the U.S. Representative. We are in the 33rd Congressional District. There are 435 members of the House. California has 53 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. Their seats are allocated roughly by population. So we're the largest state, we have the largest delegation. Representatives have 2-year terms. There are no term limits for U.S. House. The top 2 vote getters proceed to the general election, again, regardless of their party or what percentage of the vote they get. So no one can win in that particular election outright in the primary. Fred, why don't you take the next couple?
Okay, before I do that, I just want to show you that you get a lot of stuff election time in old-fashioned snail mail. You get, from the county, you get your sample ballot, a booklet that goes through and has an actual replica of what your ballot looks like, and then has things like ballot arguments, yes and no on the various measures, and the text of the measures themselves. This year we got another mailing from the county about the new vote center process that listed all the vote centers in the county and what the new voting process is. The city has Measure N on the ballot, so the city sent a voter information guide as well that talked about voting in the city of Calabasas and had arguments related to the city measure. And then I think, James, you have the state booklet. And then
Yes.
there was a state measures on this ballot as well, so you had a state booklet. So every voter in the city through the mail got a whole bunch of stuff to read. All of this is also online, but you get all of that. And if you're a vote-by-mail voter, and I think close to half of the voters in Calabasas are vote-by-mail voters, meaning they've signed up in advance to just be mailed a ballot, you get a ballot. 30 days in advance of the election, give or take, they mail them out, and you get, this is an actual vote-by-mail ballot that they give you in advance your I voted sticker, and then your ballot to fill out and mail back in the envelope that's included. So there's a lot of stuff that comes to all the voters, and I'm happy to pass this around. People can take a look at the actual ballot that can be voted. Moving on with the analysis of the items that are on the ballot, James covered the first 3 ballot items: the state Senate, the state Assembly, and the United States Congress. And then you get into the city measure, which is Measure N. So this time would not normally be a normal city election time. The city elections, when we elect our council people, are the November even year elections. But there was a special measure this year put on the ballot by petition. It has to do with an apartment project on Las Virgenes Road, the Avalon Apartments. They made a proposal that they will continue to have 80 affordable housing units in exchange for being able to build 161 new units at that site. And that they went and got signatures. There's 10% of the registered voters in the city. That measure then came to the council, with the council having a choice of either adopting it or putting it on the ballot. The council put it on the ballot, and that's what's on the ballot. Yes, I agree to allow them to build 161 units in exchange for them continuing to have 80 affordable units at that site, or no, I'm against that measure. And that's on our ballot coming up next Tuesday. Did
Yes,
you want to
I
add
think-
any?
I think, Fred and I are on opposite sides of this. He's in favor of Measure N. I'm opposed. This informational brochure actually has the ballot arguments. Fred signed the one in favor. I signed the part of the one opposed. And I think maybe they could just read this. Right? If you have questions about it, we can answer it. But obviously, we disagree on this, on the substance. It's a complicated issue. It's a land use issue, and it's an affordable housing issue. You really need to look at it carefully, because otherwise, it's unlike some of the others where it's just candidates, or, this has far more material because there were arguments submitted in favor and against.
And one thing I ask you to note is, despite what you may see on your social media feed or at the presidential debate tonight, James and I disagree vehemently on this particular issue, and we get along just fine.
So far.
And are able to have very good discussions about this and lots of other issues. Moving on with the ballot, the next item on the ballot is one that you probably have heard of, because it has to do with Las Virgenes schools, and that is Measure V. So Measure V is a bond measure. This is asking the voters of the entire Las Virgenes school district, so not just Calabasas, but all of the areas of Gura, Westlake, Hidden Hills, Bell Canyon that are in the school district, whether they're willing to tax themselves. There's a tax involved. 2 cents per $100 of assessed value of the house, which would raise $198 million to be used for upgrades at all of the Las Virgenes schools. This measure requires a 55% yes vote in order to pass. And vote yes would be, yes, I'm willing to have this tax on my property and would like to have this money raised for these improvements at the schools. No is, I don't want to have that, and that's coming up on Tuesday's election. There's also a measure from the county fire district. We here in Calabasas are served by the LA County Fire Department. So some of the cities in the county have their own fire departments, LA City and others, and then other areas of the county. How many cities do you know? Is it?
It's about
58 or something?
I
Yeah.
think.
So
56? Okay, I'm off by one.
So there's
Sorry.
88 cities in LA County. 56 of them are served by the LA County Fire Department, along with unincorporated areas of the county, areas in the county that are not in a city. And all of those areas are voting on whether they want to agree to a tax on property that would raise money for the fire department to upgrade their communications, their equipment, to hire more firefighters. And a yes vote would be I agree to the tax for the fire department, and the no vote would be against that. James, do you want to do the district attorney?
Sure. The LA County DA's office prosecutes all felonies and most misdemeanors in Los Angeles County, and the district attorney essentially serves as the county's chief prosecutor. I worked for the DA's office previously for 24 years, so I can certainly answer some questions you might have about that. Each of California's 58 counties has an elected district attorney, and so that's what we're voting on this cycle. All registered voters within Los Angeles County are eligible to vote on the district attorney. This is a 4-year term. There are no term limits for district attorney. It is a nonpartisan office. Under the California Constitution, about 100 years ago, was inserted into a provision by the voters that all offices below the state legislature are nonpartisan. City council members, when we're on the ballot, we are registered in parties, but you won't see those party affiliations. The same with county supervisors, judges, county offices like the district attorney. So it's nonpartisan. If a candidate receives more than 50% of the vote in the primary, that candidate is elected outright. That is a county rule. So in other words, there are 3 candidates who are running for district attorney this time. If one of them gets more than 50%, that person is done. They've won the election. They don't have to appear on the ballot in November. If no one gets 50%, the top 2 vote getters go to the November ballot. So that's your race for district attorney. Judges of the Superior Court is very complicated. And I have written up, I'm just going to basically read through a complicated thing. I've tried to simplify it. A lot of people ask me my recommendations for judges. So basically, Superior Court judges are the lowest level of judicial officers in California. They're generally appointed by the governor unless vacancies occur or exist within a certain time frame. Then the positions go to contested elections. These offices first appear on the primary election ballot. If a candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, that candidate is elected outright. If no one passes the 50% threshold, the top 2 vote getters proceed to the general election. Terms are for 6 years, staggered that only 1/3 of them are potentially up for election each cycle. With respect to incumbent judges, they do not appear on the ballot unless another individual challenges them by filing for office. And there are no such races in this cycle. There usually are, but no one challenged an incumbent judge this time around. So 9 seats are up for contested elections this year, and again, these races are all nonpartisan. Fred?
The next thing that you'll come across on your ballot is something you may not have heard of, and that is the County Central Committee for the political parties. So the Democratic Party in LA County has a County Central Committee that actually has a couple hundred members that are elected by assembly district to go to meetings of the Democratic Party of Los Angeles County. You vote for 7 out of a list of about 12 or 13 candidates. The Republicans also have a central committee, and some of the other parties have a central committee. And depending on if you're registered to vote with that party, you'll get a ballot that allows you to vote for your representatives to the County Central Committee. The next item on this year's ballot is a county measure called Measure R. The county has a civilian oversight committee for the sheriff's department. So these are non-sheriffs that meet to oversee issues related to the sheriff's department. And what's been put on the ballot is whether or not that commission, that oversight commission, should have the ability to subpoena documents and subpoena testimony from people to come before them. This has come up recently. There's been issues where there's been controversies with the sheriff's department, and this commission went to investigate, and the sheriff didn't want to turn over certain records, so it came to a head, and they put on the ballot the question, yes, this commission should have that power to subpoena records, or no, that it should not, and that is regular straight majority, 50% to pass. I didn't mention when we were talking about the fire district that it's 2/3 to pass.
Okay,
so it is
that's
interesting how, and there's long histories as to how all these different things get different numbers to pass. The school bond, 55%. But the tax for the fire department is a 2/3 vote, 66.7% is needed to pass that. Measure R, the county measure, just a straight 50%. Then we have a state measure on the ballot. So this election, we actually have a city measure, a school district measure, a fire district measure, a county measure, and a state measure,
I don't think we've
all
ever
on
had
the
that.
same ballot. That's unusual. We have a state measure called Prop 13. This has become very confusing to people because Prop 13 years ago was a very famous proposition that lowered property taxes in the state, and almost became a signature statement. If you were for Prop 13, you were for lower taxes, and this was back in the late 1970s, right? So it's
78, I think.
yeah, so it's coming up on almost 40 plus 50 years ago, and people still think of that Prop 13. They went through all the numbers and went back and started at 1, so we have a new Prop 13 that has nothing to do with that. It's a school bond for the entire state. So it's an issue of whether or not people want to have the state borrow $15 billion for school improvements throughout the entire state of California to be paid back by general tax funds. So this is not one that will result in a specific tax being added to individual properties. It'll be money owed by the state. The Sacramento legislature will decide how to pay for and allocate that money. So yes would be yes. I support this, the state going in, taking this debt in order to do school improvements. No would be no, and that would be a straight 50% majority to pass. And that gets us to the very last thing on the ballot, and this is also new, that it's the last thing on the ballot, is the presidential election. And this is the presidential primary. You've probably heard of 3, 4, 5, 6 of the Democratic candidates. I have a Democratic ballot.
And I have a Republican one.
There's actually 15 or 16 candidates on here, some of whom are still running, some of whom are not. They signed up and since then have dropped out. But you have this whole list of candidates in the Democratic primary for president to vote for. And what's new is you used to get the ballot and it would go from president on down. And what would happen is a lot of people would show up to vote for president and wouldn't go and vote for the other offices, because the local issues were just not as important to them. So the state decided we're going to flip it, and we're going to put our local offices first and president last in an effort to see if that gets people to vote more thoroughly throughout the whole ballot. So this is the first time ever your presidential candidates are the last thing on the ballot, and you have lots of choices, at least on the Democratic side, and then a very complicated process of what this means. In the Democratic primary, you're really electing delegates to go to the Democratic convention this summer, who will then elect the nominee. And the way they do it in California is by each congressional district, they'll tally the votes of who won and then assign delegates to the convention. So a district that has lots of Democrats will actually have more delegates to be assigned than a district that has fewer Democrats. You have to get at least 15% of the vote in a congressional district to get delegates. So in our congressional district, represented by Congressman Ted Lieu, whoever on this list gets 15% or more will be assigned proportionally a number of delegates that will be pledged to them at the convention this summer in Milwaukee, where those delegates will then vote to nominate the nominee for President of the United States from the Democratic Party.
Well, the Republican primary is a little less exciting. You have the incumbent president running. There are, on my ballot, there are 7 Republicans. One of them is Donald Trump, and there are 6. There are some, names you might know, like Bill Weld, who was a former governor of Massachusetts, Joe Walsh, a former congressman from Illinois, but nobody who's likely to get very many votes. The Republican primary works a lot like the Democratic primary. There are some differences. In California, if you're a Democrat, you can vote in the Democratic primary, or if you're an independent or declined to state, you're not registered with any other party, you can also ask for a Democratic ballot and vote in the Democratic primary. On the Republican side, only registered Republicans can vote in the Republican primary. And that we have a number of minor parties like the Libertarians, the Greens, the Reform Party still around. They all have different rules as well. So those are your basic rules about who can vote in which primary. As far as the allotment of delegates, it's really complex. The Democratic National Convention actually has more delegates overall. That's a rule they made as to the total number of delegates than the Republican National Convention, which is a little bit smaller. Also, each of the parties rewards states differently. Like California has voted Democratic in the last several presidential elections. It has 2 Democrats in the U.S. Senate. It has an overwhelming Democratic majority in the House of Representatives, Democratic governor, office holders. They get rewarded for that by having more delegates awarded to them by the Democratic National Committee. On the Republican side, because there are so few elected Republicans in California, delegates are taken away from California and given to states that vote more Republican, like Texas and Ohio and some of the other states. So that's some of the disparity. So it's not exactly equal in terms of how each party makes its own internal rules. They are subject to some provisions. You have to have a due process, but each party is given fairly wide latitude. It is the presidential election now in California is the only election which is closed, where the parties get to make their own rules and regulate who votes in those primaries. All other elections are all the candidates, regardless of party, get into the same ballot. So with that, did you want to add anything?
Well, James, I just didn't know if you we have a few minutes to give a little analysis of what you think, what you expect to look for in this election in terms of turnout, in terms of some of the.
Sure. Let's talk about turnout. Turnout is governed really by excitement of the election. And on the Republican side, there's not much excitement because there's no U.S. Senate race, there's no governor's race, there's no contested statewide offices. So really what you have is probably Republicans don't turn out quite as much in California. On the Democratic side, we usually have our primaries in June. We moved it up to March just so that California could have more of a say in the presidential primaries. We have a wide open Democratic race. It is unsettled. There are several major Democrat candidates who are running, and any one of them could, win the election. March 3rd is Super Tuesday, which adds more excitement to the race because so many states, how many is it, 15 or so states are voting in the presidential election. So on March 3rd, we're likely to have a really good idea who the Democratic nominee is going to be. So I think you're going to have a really heavy turnout of Democrats. In Calabasas, I would say the final turnout is likely to be 2-1. For every one Republican that shows up to vote, maybe 2 Democrats. Does that sound about right?
I think that's right. I think we'll have a big Democratic turnout because there's a lot of choices on that side and a lot of differences of opinion. And the Republican turnout may be a little lower because there's no real controversy or race on that side.
By contrast, in 2014, when there was a very high Republican turnout that year in the primary, I looked at the final turnout in the primary, and it was a low turnout too. There was almost exactly the same number, down to about 10 people. It was almost exactly the same number of Republicans turning out to Democrats turning out. Calabasas is weighted in favor of the Democrats. There's more registered Democrats here than Republicans. So in any given election, there are more Democrats are going to show up at the polls. But it gets more balanced or more imbalanced depending upon, the nature of the year.
But generally, I expect a high turnout election. It is a presidential year, and certainly on the Democratic side, there's still quite a split of opinion amongst a number of candidates. So I think that there will be a good-sized turnout.
I would say 40%. Does that sound right?
I think it'll be higher for the primary.
Okay.
Locally, we mentioned some of the measures. The Measure N in Calabasas is drawing some attention, and you see some campaigning going on that. The school bond measure is an important measure. That one needs 55%, makes it a little harder to get to that number. And then the fire department, the FD, requires 2/3. And it'll be very interesting, James, to see if anybody can get 2/3 vote. It's always a hard mark to get.
Yeah.
This is a year where I think there is a little bit of anxiety in terms of additional taxes and so forth. They're being asked on this ballot to vote for 3 additional taxes, 2 direct taxes and a bond measure. And I think 2/3 is going to be tough to get.
It'll be tough. I actually think the fire measure is going to do fairly well in Calabasas because of the recent fires. I think when people read about, we're in a high danger area for fires. When people read about upgrading and improving technology and all that, I think the voters out here will be a little more inclined, based on the recent threats, to go ahead and do that. But it's anybody's guess. I agree 2/3 is very hard, and most bond measures these days that take 2/3 vote do fail up and down the state. Yeah. We do have some time for questions, though, and I wanted to leave some time. I'm sure you guys have some, hopefully.
Hi, you had mentioned that the fire department and school board measure required more than 50% to vote. What's the requirement to pass? What's the requirement for Measure N?
50%.
Measure N is a straight 50%, as is Measure R and
Yes.
Prop 13.
Yes.
Yes.
So the previous Proposition 13, was that pro like raising taxes or pro like not raising taxes?
The original Prop 13 was a lowering of taxes. And what it was basically is people, when you own a piece of property, you own your home, you have an assessed value of the home. It's usually the price you paid for the house. Becomes the assessed value when you buy the house, and then you pay a percentage of that as your tax. Prior to Prop 13, the assessor would reassess your house on an annual basis. So even if the house didn't change hands, you paid $500,000 for it, it would go up as prices went up. So someone who could afford the taxes when they moved into the house, all of a sudden was paying more and more taxes because the home values were going up. This locked in your assessment, said your assessment is what it is when you bought the house, with a small increase, up to 2% increase a year. So that, and property taxes had gotten high, property values were going up, people were saying, I can't afford to live in my house because I can't pay the taxes. And Prop 13 came in and locked that in. So here we are 40 plus years later, and it's a very interesting situation. I have two neighbors who both bought their houses in the 1970s, and they pay taxes based on an assessment that's now about $200,000. I bought my house in the 90s for $400,000, and I pay taxes on that. And then the person who just bought the house 2 doors down, who paid $1.2 million for the house, pays taxes on that. So we all live on the same block in basically the same houses, and we could pay, frankly, you could pay 5, 6, 7, in some cases 10 times more taxes. So it's but that's the system that we have, and to undo it would mean that these neighbors, these older neighbors who've been there since the 70s, their house would be reassessed to $1 million, their tax would go up 5, 6 times, they might not be able to afford that.
And numbers, you kind of touched on it, but numbers are coincidental. The state assigns numbers to each proposition in order of how they're certified for the ballot. And every 10 years or so, they start back with one again. So it's just this has nothing to do with the original Prop 13. This is a complete coincidence that it's Prop 13.
Right. So it was a lowering of taxes, and you know, there's really since then one of the most basic controversies in California was people fighting to keep those taxes low versus other people who think the taxes should be higher so that we can pay for more services.
Now, just so you're aware, the state is in the process of conducting the census, because we do that every 10 years. In 2020, sometime they'll start undertaking the census. After they're done with the census, California has a redistricting commission, and all of the districts will be redone. The 40 state Senate districts, the 80 state assembly districts, and however many congressional districts we have after they divvy it up. We're probably going to go from 53 down to 52 because we haven't grown as large as some of the other states. So we could wind up with a totally new congressman. We could wind up in a totally newly configured district. It all depends. So this is the last election that will be run with these particular borders.
So a couple things that are very interesting. We're the world's greatest democracy. We believe in voting and one man, one vote, one woman, one vote. The one office in the whole country where the actual votes are not what elect the person is the president and vice president of the United States. Every other office, if you get more votes than the other person, you win. That's not necessarily true with the president. As we discussed in the primary, you're electing delegates to the convention that get proportioned out, and then they get a nominee. And then, of course, in the fall election, the final election in the fall, you're actually electing electors to the Electoral College who go on to vote in the Electoral College and do the actual voting for President of the United States. And we've now had twice in the last 5 elections, presidential elections, the winner not be the person who actually had the most votes. And that was, so it's a very interesting situation. It has to do with the compromise that was made way back when the Constitution started, that the small states didn't want to be overrun by the big states. So instead of having it be raw votes, they did it based on the Electoral College. And the small states were right. You know, the reason that Hillary Clinton got more votes than Donald Trump was because of California and New York, which are the two most populous states, voted so much in favor of one candidate that you had these huge millions of votes advantage, even though lots and lots of other states that have much smaller numbers. So it's a grand compromise. It's something that I don't think people expected to come up quite so often as it has in the last several elections, and it is something that people are talking about, whether or not there should be at some point some change, although that would be it's very difficult to change the Constitution.
Yeah,
it can be done.
It's hard.
But very, very hard to do.
Another interesting thing that we didn't talk about is caucuses. Does anyone know what a caucus is? You've heard about the caucuses? Okay, thank goodness we don't have one here. I don't know how it would work. There are a lot of states that still have caucuses. It used to be that I think every state started out having caucuses, if I remember right. They didn't cast votes, they just went to a caucus. In a caucus, you would go to a regional area and sit there all night and debate candidates and cast votes, round 1, round 2, round 3. So you also have situations in some caucuses where the winner of the caucus could just be somebody who brought only maybe a couple thousand people participated in the entire state, and you won by getting your voters out there and sitting in the caucus all night. I think the caucus may be on its way out after we've had a few little glitches this year. Did they ever finish counting in Iowa? I don't think they're recounting and recounting.
And Nevada.
And yeah.
And then caucus means a different thing in each place too. I mean, in Iowa, they actually go to a room and do that. In Nevada, it's really sort of a preferential voting system where you go in and vote your first choice, second choice, third choice, and if your first choice gets knocked out, they count your second choice vote. It's a different type of system.
We have time for one of James's cute stories, and I love telling cute stories. On the ballot, there's a judicial candidate. One of the games people play are with their titles. You see all these creative titles, and some of them don't mean anything. Okay, there's a candidate, and the rules are pretty strict. There's a candidate who filed and put down retired judge, which he was. He was a judge many, many years ago. If you're retired beyond a certain period of time, you can't put retired anything. So another candidate challenged him and knocked the retired judge off the ballot. So this candidate went down to the registrar recorder and changed his first name to be Judge. So now he's back on the ballot, and this time it's not a title, it's his actual first name is now Judge. It was Michael, but now it's Judge. So there's a lot of creative things on the ballot. The point of the story is look carefully, because you want to be electing the people who are most ethical and who are going to serve you in the best capacity.
One other thing I wanted to mention, James, is that's new in this election is the date. We have a very early presidential primary this year. California historically was one of the last states to have its primary. We had a June election. And there was a feeling that we were sort of left out. By the time the election, the presidential primary came to California, the nominees had pretty much already been determined because most of the other states had voted. So the legislature changed the election to March, put us early on, relatively early on. We're going to be on Super Tuesday. Only 4 states will have voted before us. And we certainly become more of a factor in who's going to win in this year, the Democratic primary. We know who's going to win the Republican primary. But last time it would have been the opposite, pretty much. So it's interesting to see what that means. On the one hand, we are voting earlier. We clearly will have a bigger effect on who's the front runner going into the rest of the primary season. On the other hand, as you can see, we're a week away. We're 6 days away from the primary election. People are already voting here, and we've had very little presidential campaigning here in the state. Some of the candidates who have a lot of money have run a lot of ads on TV and radio, but you haven't seen much of the candidates. You haven't seen a lot of signs on lawns. You haven't seen a lot of people knocking on doors because, one, it's very hard to run a nationwide campaign. I mean, they've been going state to state, and on next Tuesday, there's 15 states voting. Two, California is a very tough state to run because if you are going to try to run a campaign here, you have to have a lot of money, very expensive to advertise. It's a huge place. You need a lot of people. And so we moved the primary early. We're more of a factor, but in my view, we've really had less of a campaign. We haven't had the candidates here to speak, to be covered on our local media.
You know the irony? I have an irony for you, Fred. If this election goes down, and they're talking about it to the Democratic side going all the way through because no one's going to get a majority, if we had kept it in June and we were alone in June with 10% or 15% of the delegates, this state would have been inundated with candidates and attention.
Yeah.
Now, we're not. You mentioned media markets. In some states, there's one big city, like just say the state of Georgia has Atlanta, where if you advertise on television, you're getting all of metro Atlanta, you're getting a good chunk of the state. Here, you really can't do that effectively. There's too many urban centers and they're too spread out and they're too expensive to advertise in. So I think what do you think of that? If we had kept it in June?
It's as it's turning out now, it's possible. June, it's usually pretty much over, but that's certainly what's happened the last few times. So it's a very difficult call. So this year we're going to have this early primary, lots of candidates to choose from, still wide open, but virtually no campaign. And then what's happened in California the last few elections, I don't think James will even disagree with me, is everybody knows who's going to win California. The Democratic is going to win California. The Democrats in California outnumber Republicans by millions and millions of voters. And so here we go to elect President of the United States, and there's virtually no campaign in California because they're not spending their time here because they already know what's going to happen. So they're out in the states that are closer. They're campaigning in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and states that could go either way. So we have a year here where we're going to elect President of the United States, obviously a very, very important thing to do, and we're going to have very little campaigning in this state, in either the primary or the general election.
What you'll see is these candidates will come in, they'll swoop in around June or July because they'll have all their fundraisers here. And both parties consistently, California almost always is a number one source of income for both the Democrats and the Republicans because there are a lot of well-to-do individuals here who donate. So they'll come in, and the last appearance they'll do is around end of July, beginning of August, and you'll never see them again. You won't see any advertising. I kind of miss it. I'm a little older than most of you. So I remember the days when I was in college and, out in the professional world as a younger person. And do you remember the commercials? We used to get the commercials all the time from both candidates. The presidential candidates used to use Pierce College as a place where they would go and have their rallies, and it used to be like Labor Day or right before the election, because California was a closely contested state. But I agree with you. They won't step foot in here after August, would be my guess.
Yeah. Are there any additional questions? Yes.
What's a superdelegate? I don't understand the superdelegate.
What's a superdelegate?
Okay, so a superdelegate is, we're talking about to the party convention. So you can speak for the Republicans, but I know for the Democrats, these delegates will be elected and they'll go to the convention in Milwaukee. They'll vote for the nominee. Some of the delegates are elected, as I stated. You get 15% in a congressional district. You're going to be assigned a certain number of delegates that are pledged to you. Then there are other delegates that get selected. Certain state office holders, if you're the governor, the lieutenant governor, some of the state office holders, they get to be delegates, okay? Some of the members of the state Democratic Party get to be delegates. So those are called superdelegates because they're not selected through the election process, but they're selected in other ways, often not committed to a particular candidate, and they can go and vote for whoever they choose to vote for at the convention. So there are a number of those delegates as well out of the, I think California sends 400 and some odd delegates to the Democratic convention, and you need just under 2,000 votes, 1,990 something, to be the nominee. So California is a big part of that selection. It's only 1 out of 50 states, but it's by population, it gets you almost a quarter of the way to election if you can put all those votes together.
Each party has different rules on who the superdelegates are and what roles they play. Both parties kind of downplayed a little bit the role of the superdelegates in recent years because of allegations that the superdelegates were kind of working behind the scenes to support one candidate in case the regular elected delegates supported someone they didn't like. So there were all types of accusations back and forth. I know on the Democratic side, I don't know on the Republican side as much, but I know on the Democratic side they've kind of changed the rules about what superdelegates can do in their powers.
Right, and there's fewer.
They're stricter and there are fewer. And I think on the Republican side it's been a little less restrictive, but they have changed the rules there too.
Any other questions? Yes.
Is the city of Calabasas expected to have a higher voter turnout this year compared to the last time they voted?
What, you mean the last presidential primary?
Yes.
Yes, because in the last presidential primary was in June of 2016, and there was not a contested, neither race was contested at that point. Well, the Democratic race.
It was Hillary and Bernie. With the number of candidates this time, it is expected that there'll be somewhat of a higher turnout. And we also have a local measure on the ballot we did not have a local measure on the ballot at that time.
Yeah, and in 2016 there was an open Senate seat too.
Right.
So, I mean, there are some things in 2016 versus this year that are different, but all in all, I would expect it to be a little bit higher turnout.
Now, in the November election of this year, I think we may have mentioned, the Calabasas City Council race will be on the ballot. So this is the year 2 of the members of the City Council's terms are up. So anyone could run for those seats. And that's an election where the highest vote getter, or in this case, the 2 highest vote getters, get elected, regardless of how many votes. They don't have to have 50%. It's just whoever gets the most votes out of whatever list of candidates there are elected to the city council, no runoff.
California just changed a rule recently in the last several years where our city council races used to be standalone, where we'd have them first in March of the odd years and in November of the odd years. Now we're required, as are all cities, to go into November or the primary of a regular election year. So there are no more standalone city council elections unless there's a vacancy and you have a special election.
I do think the November election this year will be a very high turnout election.
Yeah.
Be deciding whether to reelect President Trump or not reelect President Trump. I think people have very strong opinions about that on both sides. So I expect that'll bring a very big turnout of people to vote in November this year. Yes?
What % of the votes is the superdelegates?
What percentage?
Well,
I think it's about
10?
Something in the range of 10 to 20%.
They have really, but the rule has changed such that I don't think they can. I think they have limited voting powers, don't they? Doesn't it have to go to a certain stage before they cast deciding votes?
There are some new rules related to that. I don't know exactly what.
So it's 10. I thought it was closer to 10. He's probably right. I haven't followed it quite as closely. But it's definitely not very many in overall. It's not 50-50 or anything.
Any other questions? Yes.
Have the Republicans even tried to push someone to contest Trump, or are they fully behind him?
Well, I mean, anyone can file. There are certain filing rules. There are 7 Republicans running, one of which is Donald Trump. You weren't here earlier, but among the candidates are a former Republican congressman and a former Republican governor. Those are probably the two you might recognize, Joe Walsh and Bill Weld. What do I think will happen? I think Trump will probably get 80 to 90% of the vote in California in the primary, and the rest of these candidates combined will get 10, 15%. It's mostly probably a protest vote rather than people saying, hey, I want to vote for Zoltan Istvan over Donald Trump, so I'm going to, most of these are completely unknown names.
Right. There is no real challenger on the Republican side to Trump. Bill Weld is a former governor of Massachusetts. I mean, has a serious record, and he was the one who stepped forward and said, I'm going to challenge Trump on the Republican side, but he's really not caught on. I mean, he has not really garnered any support anywhere around the country in any large number.
I think in 2016 he was the vice presidential nominee on the Libertarian ticket, was he not? With Gary Johnson.
He might have been.
So that happens a lot too, where people switch around parties and whatever. I think he was. But even if all these candidates get, 2, 3, 5% of the vote, there's a threshold for delegates, and it's very unlikely that any of these candidates will get delegates anywhere. In my assessment, do you see them getting any delegates out of here?
Which, the other Republican?
Yeah.
No. I don't, none of them have any name.
We had in 2016,
Weld has won one delegate so far, though.
Oh, okay.
In New Hampshire.
And he was governor of Massachusetts for a while. He might do well there, which is on Super Tuesday. I don't know. But, in 2016, you had a protest vote in the Republican primary, even though Donald Trump was the de facto nominee by then. In November, more than 10% of the public voted for a third-party candidate, which was a near record considering there was no major third-party candidate. I imagine most of those were protest votes. And there's write-in candidates.
Historically, there have been times when even an incumbent president has been challenged within his own party. It's a big deal. It's usually considered, you're usually not looked at too favorably by other members of the party because, for example, the example I'm thinking of was in 1980, Jimmy Carter was the Democratic president, and Ted Kennedy, the brother of John Kennedy, who had been president, decided to challenge him, even as a Democrat, even though his fellow party member was the incumbent. And they had a very big battle, and sure enough, it and lots of other things resulted in the Republican winning. If you're going to challenge the president of your own party, you're going to do so at great political peril. And it's not done, it doesn't happen very often, but it has happened.
I think when in a fully contested primary where both candidates go all the way down to the wire, the incumbent president's always won. But what's happened is, just like Fred said, it's almost always weakened the incumbent president beyond repair. I mean, Bush 1 had a strong challenge in 1992 that seriously weakened him. Right. In 1980, it was Jimmy Carter. You can go back in time and see all that, and so it's heavily discouraged by the party. In some states, they cancel their primaries because they're allowed to, or they kick people off the ballot through various little loopholes and rules that they can do that to avoid any kind of embarrassment or publicity for a challenger. California, it's a little bit harder to do that. You usually have to put everyone who's filed properly on the ballot.
Yes.
Who are you voting for in the primary?
I'm happy to tell you that I have endorsed Mike Bloomberg for president. I think that he not only is very qualified to do the job, to actually run the government, he's a competent manager of the government, but I think he has the best chance, in my mind, to actually defeat Donald Trump, which, as a Democrat, that's what I'd like to see happen in November. So I have endorsed Mike Bloomberg for president.
I haven't endorsed anybody, and I didn't in 2016 either, and I didn't, I look at the ballot and I don't know a lot about these candidates. I know who 3 of them are. I'm going to look at the other 4 and make a decision, but I haven't committed to anyone, and I won't be endorsing in November either. Unless I get a surprise. If Fred were on the ticket, I would vote for Fred. But some of the other Democrats, or almost all the other Democrats, I probably wouldn't vote for. But there are other parties too. Remember, in the November ballot, you'll have quite a few choices. And I actually go through the entire ballot these days, and I do my research on the candidates, including the write-ins. And, you know, I try to do my best to pick who I think would do the best job of running the country. I have to tell you, as a Republican and, you know, a lifelong Republican, I've been disappointed with both parties in the level of acrimony and negativity that has gone on. There's no more civility in government, and it really disturbs me. At the council level, we don't have that as much. I mean, there are some councils that don't get along or that are partisan, and I don't think our council could be characterized as partisan. There may be personality or political differences on issues, but I don't think we behave anything like the Congress. And you can watch our meetings and see. Every now and then someone will get a little ornery up there, but mostly it's very civil and it's confined to the issues at hand. And I wish the Congress would do that, and the president.
Any further questions? Anybody here old enough to vote on Tuesday? Very good. All right. Did you vote already, or are you planning on voting? Okay. And how about by November? Do we have a lot of people that will be ready to go by November? Good. And of course, you can register to vote now to get ready to be eligible to vote in November. And I hope you will do that. You know, historically, younger voters have not turned out in greater numbers. The older voters have dominated. And I really think that it would be a great thing for the country if younger voters participated more and voted more. And I think this year we're going to see a greater number, but it's something that hopefully you'll all take to heart and be involved with. And certainly by being here tonight, it's great to see your interest. So thank you very much for attending, and get out and vote, and good night.
Good night.